In this lecture, we will be looking at different types of sex offenders. Specifically, we will be covering the different types of sex offenders. We will be looking at the motivators and some of the factors that to sexual crime and rape. Before we start, let's look at some of these questions. Number 1. True or false? The answer is false. Most sexual crimes are actually committed. In fact, out of 10 sexual crimes, 6 of 67 actually know the perpetrator, and very often they may also be a family member. 2. Sex crimes are crimes of passion and desire. Answer is false. Every sex crime is not a crime of passion and desire, but is instead a crime that involves violence, a sense of power and control over the victim. Question 3, or Statement 3. Sex offenders commit crimes for sexual gratification. It is partly true, because sex offenders do commit crimes or do get gratification from their crimes, but the gratification is not necessarily from or not necessarily sexual in nature. Instead, the gratification may also come from intimidating victims. Statement 4. People provoke sexual assaults by dressing sexually. The answer is false. People of both genders, all ages, professions, and styles of dress have become victims of sexual crime. And this pattern is clearly supported by the statistics that we draw from across the world. The next statement, only certain types of people are sexually assaulted. As with the previous statement, the answer is false, because people of all genders, all professions and styles may become victims, which is also why the last statement, men and boys can't be raped, is false. This slide shows us some clips from recent occurrences of sexual crime that have occurred in schools. They involve mothers who sexually abuse children, caretakers who abuse their children, even prison officers, or even one prison officer who was found guilty of molesting a male inmate within the prison environment. Sexual abuse that starts online through the process of grooming. And in the last article, which is in the bottom right hand corner, it also looks at how sometimes family members cover up for one another when they know that their loved one has actually been the perpetrator who has victimized another person. At times, the other person or the victim may even be a family member, such in the case of the woman who covered up her husband's rape of their niece. Now, we know that sexual crimes occur quite widely, and they occur across countries, across genders, across age groups. But exactly how do we define what sexual assault is? If we look at a wide definition of sexual assault, it includes a wide range of victimizations, and basically the core of it is that it involves unwanted sexual contact between the victim and the offender. These kinds of sexual assaults may or may not involve force, and may include things such as grabbing or fondling the victim. In some cases, sexual assaults may also include verbal threats. If the victim is threatened in any way, if she or he does not agree to accede to the perpetrator's request. Sexual assault may also include penile or vaginal intercourse, contact between the genitals and the mouth, contact between an anus and a penis, or the penetration of a vagina or anus with a foreign object, including a finger. Mentioned earlier, it may also include non-physical violence, such as verbally sexually themed insults, or even the threat of violence. For example, threatening the victim that I will tell people we had sex if you don't accede to my request, or even emotional blackmail, where somebody says, I will hurt myself if you don't agree to my request. So as you can see, The definition of sexual assault is actually very wide, and it covers a really wide range of actions and behaviors, some of which we may not traditionally think of as coming under the realm of sexual assault. One of the more commonly identified forms of sexual assault is rape. Rape is defined as forced sexual intercourse, including both psychological coercion or physical force. That is, when we look at the term force or the definition of the word force, it doesn't need to involve physical force, but it may also involve psychological coercion or emotional blackmail. Sexual intercourse here refers to vaginal, anal, or oral penetration by the offender. This category also includes incidences where penetration is from a foreign object such as a bottle, and it may include attempted rapes. It covers both male and female victims and both heterosexual and homosexual rape. Now, if we look at the definition of rape in more detail, rape can actually be divided into four main categories. That is statutory rape, rape by fraud, marital rape, or date rape. Statutory rape basically involves intercourse with somebody who is below 14 years old, with or without her consent. Date rape, on the other hand, involves someone being raped by somebody that they know that they're romantically involved with or on a date with. This could occur, or this usually occurs when sexual intercourse happens within the premises or context of a date without the victim's consent. It may occur as a result of the victim being drugged or just being forced. Marital rape is rape that occurs within the context of a marriage, where the husband continues to have sexual intercourse with the wife even though she does not want to have sexual intercourse. And finally, rape by fraud or rape by deception is a crime in which the perpetrator has the victim's sexual consent and compliance against it through deception or fraudulent statements and action. One example of this is happened in 2008 when it was reported that a woman unknowingly had sex with her boyfriend's brother in the dark basement that she was sleeping in. She didn't know that it was her boyfriend's brother. She thought it was her boyfriend who had actually approached her. At that point in time, the boyfriend's brother could not be prosecuted because the law in the US at that time required that rape include the use of force. In this case, there was obviously no force because she thought it was her boyfriend who approached her for sex. In the Singapore context, rape is defined by the Penal Code as 375. And the specific definition states that a man commits rape when he has sexual intercourse with a woman under the circumstances falling under any of the following 5 descriptions. Number 1, the sexual intercourse was against her will or without her consent. Number 2, when her consent was obtained, but it was obtained by putting her in fear of death or hurt. Number 3, when the man knows that he is not her husband and her consent is given. In this case, the perpetrator pretends to be the woman's husband or pretends to be somebody else to gain her consent. And finally, sexual intercourse with anybody who is under 14 years old, regardless of whether she did or did not give her consent. The punishment for rape in Singapore is imprisonment of up to 20 years and caning. Now, if you look at these definitions here, you will see that under the Penal Code Act 375, there is no such thing as marital rape, and there is no such thing as boys or men being raped, in the sense that rape can only occur against a woman, where a woman is the only one who can be a victim. This is something that's being debated widely in certain circles and may change in the near future, as it has already changed in many other countries. Okay, there are also other forms which are listed in this table here. We've got pedophilia, which is when sexual assault or sexual crimes are committed against children through sexual contact with children, and very often pedophiles actually offend in this way because they have a strong sexual attraction to children or feel a strong connection with children when they cannot form these connections with adults. We will look at this in more detail later on in the lecture. There is also something called hebephilia, which is like pedophilia, but it is specific to sexual contact by adult males targeted at young adolescents. Usually, these adolescents are also male. Then it also differentiates between sexual assault or sexual contact by a family member and outside a non-family member. Intrafamilial child molestation, for example, is defined as sexual contact with a minor child by someone within the immediate family. This may include the child's father, mother, brother, sister, uncle, cousin. Extrafamilial child molestation, on the other hand, refers to sexual contact with a minor child by somebody outside the immediate family. Now, if you remember one at the start of the lecture, I said in 6 out of 7 cases, the victim actually knows the perpetrator, and that applies to extrafamilial child molestation cases as well. In some cases, sexual assault, especially against children, is part of a more organized crime ring, such as child prostitution rings. One such case is available through this link, where you can read about a case where a group of men actually targeted, groomed a group of young girls, some as young as 12-year-old girls, and forced them into prostitution by promising them love and also getting them addicted to drugs. Now, in the next section, we're going to look at different types of sex offenders. The easiest way to categorize sex offenders is by dividing them into two groups, stranger versus non-stranger. A non-stranger would be somebody who is the victim's boyfriend, co-worker or classmate, longtime friend, relative, somebody from the neighborhood that they kind of know, even if they do not know very well, or someone that they have just met. Online sex offenders are a separate category of offenders where they actually choose and target their victims very carefully. Very often they meet their victims in chat rooms, and they often target younger people as they are more likely to be more emotionally vulnerable or naive. They're also likely to be needy, and they try and target those that they feel are open to sexually themed chats. And this they identify through the use of nicknames, for example, or by slowly broaching the subject and seeing how the other person responds to it. Very often, these online sex offenders also pretend to be much younger than they actually are and try and empathize with what the victim or the potential victim is going through to gain their trust for a start. Compared to offline sex offenders, online sex offenders often have less antisocial characteristics. However, they are likely to face greater psychological difficulties in adulthood, and this may include forming bonds or relationships with people face to face. They are likely to have a history of substance abuse, which makes it difficult for them to form prolonged or long-term relationships with others. Unsurprisingly, they are likely to have a history of internet addiction, where they spend a lot of time online and are very comfortable with their communicating with others online and not face to face. They're also very confident in their communication online, which makes it easier for them to convince the would-be victim of their innocence, their authenticity, and their genuineness. They usually target children because they have an emotional congruence with children, where they're able to emotionally relate to children well and quickly. And finally, they are also likely to have very pervasive experience of sexually deviant fantasies. Usually these fantasies involve children, and sometimes these fantasies may also be violent or more physical in nature. There's some other differences between online sex offenders and classic sex offenders, in the sense that online classic sex offenders, that means offline sex offenders, are more likely to engage in chronic sexual assault, in the sense that they are less targeted, they are less planned, and they are more based on instant urges or situational factors. They do not put as much effort into getting to know the victim, for example. Their motivation is usually to exploit the victim, and they usually rely on manipulation, lies, and concealment. They're likely to lack remorse for their actions and lack empathy for the victim. As mentioned earlier, they're likely to suffer or act based on trait-like urges in the sense that they don't plan in the long term, and they are also likely to have a pedophilic pathology where they're strongly addicted to, or not addicted, sorry, strongly attracted sexually to younger children, which is what motivates their behavior. Unlike sex offenders, on the other hand, their behaviors tend to be more situational in nature in the sense that it is not as pervasive, and their aim is to actually gain relief from the pain or the so-called pressure that they feel building inside them. They do also rely on manipulation in the sense that they rely on grooming or sex kits to gain the trust of their targeted victim. Their identity is not concealed fully in the sense that they do have to reveal a little bit about themselves to try and build a relationship. Unlike the classic sexual offender, they do acknowledge the pain that they have caused in the victim and the harm that they have caused, so they do feel remorse and empathy for the victim. They actually act on state-like urges where they have put the plan into action for a long time before actually meeting the victim, and they usually suffer from other addictive behaviors or disorders such as internet addiction and substance abuse. If you click on the link on this slide, it will take you to a video based on a real life sharing by a young girl called Alicia and her mum. Alicia was actually a victim of online grooming when she was a teenager by a much older adult who knew what he was doing. He put a lot of effort and time into building a relationship with her and gaining her trust, to the point that at one point in time she trusted him wholeheartedly, thinking that he was her best friend and that she could tell him anything. Eventually he did convince her to meet with him, and if you watch the video you will see the consequences of this relationship. Statistically, or if we look at past trends, there are a lot less female sex offenders than there are male sex offenders, and it is difficult, or it has been difficult for researchers to find a consistent definition of what a female sex offender is. Female sex offenders may be the main offender, but very often their participation is indirect in the sense that they are cooperating or working with another male sex offender. Very often their participation is indirect in the sense that they act or they perform these actions for arousal but are unlikely to be aggressive or more physical in nature. Female sex offenders can actually be classified. You've got an overseas sees herself as a child of love to a teenage man. She views herself as a mentor who is actually guiding him and teaching him about how he can become a man. You've got female sex offenders who act based on the need for exploration and exploitation, and this usually involves a younger female exploiting the female. There are female sex offenders who are predisposed to these behaviors, also some people argue, based on their own history of sexually abuse of a child or their own deviant sexual identities. There are also psychologically disturbed female sexual offenders who act or who may not have full control over their behaviors and their thought processes due to psychiatric impairments or severe psychological disorders. And finally, there are female sex offenders who are coerced into the role by a male that they are already in a relationship with. When a female sex offender and the female offender is in a relationship, victims in this case are usually males and females, and it's highly likely that after they break the relationship, they may often live out. Female sex offenders may also act independently on a continuum as in behaviors may spread over a period of time. Very often they are not caught because they portray or put themselves in the role of a caregiver, so a teacher, a mentor, an aunt, a parent's friend, so they're less likely to be caught. They are more likely to victimize acquaintances because here they can put themselves in the role of a caregiver, and they are more likely to target males than they are female. They rely very heavily on grooming and sex kits so that they can actually build relationships with their victims before the sexual offending begins. A third category of sex offenders are juvenile sex offenders, and they are used to commit sexual acts with a person of any age as long as it's against the victim's will. It usually involves aggression, exploitation, and threats or coercion. These acts are usually age inappropriate for the partner in the sense they usually target those who are younger than them. Most juvenile sex offenders have been sexually abused themselves, and an even higher percentage usually of plea abuse. The earlier they were victims themselves, the higher the chance of them offending as they become innocent. They are also more likely to have deviant sexual norms of non-sexual. They're more likely to target strangers that they do not know, but they may feel some attraction to. There's usually a certain profile that they target. They're likely to be socially isolated in the sense that they do not have relationships with many people, do not have strong relationships with many people. They're also unlikely to be able to form romantic relationships with another person, which is why they resort to sexual offending. And finally, they're less likely to empathize with the victim and instead are more likely to be focused on self-gratification and their own needs. In this next section, we'll look at some of the demographic characteristics that are common among sex offenders. Most perpetrators in the sense and they're usually unemployed or 60% have been convicted of sexual crimes before, and 98% have been convicted of other crimes. This means they're likely to have a history of a criminal record even before committing these crimes in the first place. Although there is no single profile that can actually cover everybody, there are some commonalities among sexual offenders. They usually have problems with alcohol or drug use. They usually do not have high levels of academic qualifications, where many of them have failed and dropped out of high school. They are likely to have unstable work histories, where many have not worked in one legal job for a period of 6 months or more. As a combination of their high school dropout rates as well as their unstable work histories, it's unsurprising that they usually have lower socioeconomic status, and they are also usually socially incompetent, which makes it difficult for them to form lasting relationships with others. This table actually summarizes some of the common characteristics in terms of cognitive functioning, social skills, and other demographic factors, and compares the differences between pedophiles and rapists. I'm not going to go through them one by one because I think it's quite self-explanatory and you can read through it on your own. Very few sex offenders are usually willing to talk even after they've been convicted. The main reason for this is they are very often targeted themselves in the prison if people know that they're sexual offenders, especially if they're victimized children. However, if you click on this link, you will see or you will listen to what one sexual offender who has been convicted says about what he did and why he did. If you listen to his confession, you also hear that at that point in time he did know what he was doing was wrong, but he continued doing it anyway. Now, if most sexual offenders are they then mentally ill? The answer is probably no, because research suggests that less than 4% of sex offenders are mentally ill. Most sex offenders actually know what they're doing, although about 30% are likely to have antisocial characteristics. Many have paraphilic urges that they find difficult to ignore, and these may include obsessive thoughts or compulsive urges. Rapists can be divided into different categories. The first two categories are the power assurance rapist and the power assertive rapist. The power assurance rapist is the most common type of rapist, where rape is concerned or rape is committed with the aim of dealing with the rapist's insecurities about his own masculinity. After a while, he finds that committing rape or the offense in itself doesn't help him deal with his insecurities, because the insecurities are very deep-rooted and there is a need to offend again and again. Very often the intensity or the frequency of the offense also increases over a period of time. Power assurance rapists usually don't use a lot of force. Instead, they may choose to threaten the victim to get what they want. Very often the rape is planned, in the sense that the victim is targeted and followed for a period of time before the act is actually carried out. They usually take away some form of a trophy, either an item of clothing or some hair or something that reminds them of the victim that they can look back at later and probably engage in sexual fantasies with later. They prefer their victim to be sufficiently passive, and that's probably also why the use of force is not that great. The power assertive rapist, on the other hand, is quite different because he does not have insecurities about his masculinity and is instead usually very sexually confident. He uses rape as a means to express his virility or power over women, and this type of offender is usually socially skilled and found in social locations. They are charming and they are able to convince their targeted victims to come with them due to their high levels of social skills. They initially appear to be friendly, but this often changes quickly as they start getting what they want, or if the victim resists. If the victim resists, an extreme amount of violence may be applied, especially in the later stages. Their offences may not be planned as well as a power assurance rapist, and their offences are usually irregular or scattered in the sense there is no common pattern. Very often, they involve rapes in the sense that they actually already know the woman and the woman has already agreed to go out and meet them and sometimes engage in flirtation or some form of lighter physical intimacy with them. The other two types of rapists are the anger retaliation rapists and the anger excitement rapists. A classic example of the anger retaliatory rapist is Jack the Ripper, where the offender has very high levels of anger towards women. The attacks are usually very short but intense. And usually there is a similarity between the victim and the woman that the offender has a grudge against, in the sense they may pick victims who look similar to the woman that they're actually angry with, and that person could be their mother, could be their ex-girlfriend, ex-wife, and so on. The attacks may be fairly regular in nature and are triggered by pent-up anger, and they find that this is the only way that they can release or express their anger. The anger excitement rapist, on the other hand, is the least common type of rapist. This type of rapist gains his pleasure or sexual arousal or excitement from the victim's distress. So the more distressed the victim is, the higher the levels of his sexual excitement. He usually practices or involves his practices usually involve infliction of pain, and the violence level is high. So high, in fact, that often the victim dies at the end of the whole incident. This type of rapist doesn't hesitate to involve torture or to apply torture in the process of raping the victim. This may include the use of blindfolds, gags, and ropes. Very often, the rape is carefully and very methodologically planned. He or she may record the offense, for example, on video to watch back later. The attacks do not occur as often and are usually irregular in nature, which sometimes makes it more difficult for the police or authorities to track the person down. Now that we have looked at the different types of rapists, let's look at the different ways that we can categorize rape patterns. We know that rape patterns, for example, can be categorized as displaced aggression, compensatory rapists, or sexually aggressive in nature. Rape patterns are categorized as being a result of displaced aggression when the attacks are violent and aggressive in nature, and because the focus is on the violence and aggression, there's usually minimal sexual feeling or sexual arousal. Instead, the rapist gains pleasure from sadistic acts or hurting the victim. Very often, the rapist has had a chaotic and unstable childhood himself. Compensatory rapists, on the other hand, are usually not sadistic in nature, and they rape or carry out sexual assaults as a form of sexual gratification due to intense sexual arousal. They feel a need to prove their sexual prowess to make up for their feelings of inadequacy or feelings of sexual inadequacy. As individuals, they're usually passive or withdrawn in nature. Sexually aggressive rapes, on the other hand, are in a sense a combination of the first two categories, where the rapist is sadistic in nature and his motives are both sexual arousal and to actually perform sadistic acts. Usually, this type of rapist has been abused as a child and has low levels of frustration tolerance, which is why they quickly engage in escalating levels of violence when the victim tries to fight back. Tonight and since night by looking at their history before. They propose that rapists with when they were younger are likely to develop traits of callousness or unemotionality, which is displayed through arrogance, deceitfulness, callousness, and emotional detachment. They may also display certain forms of antisocial behavior, such as aggression and impulsive acting out. Those who have suffered or who are victims of sexual abuse, on the other hand, may have high levels of sexual drive or may be preoccupied with sexual needs or sexual arousal a lot of the time. They're usually sexually compulsive, show or display signs of hypersexuality, and have aggressive sexual fantasies. They say that by looking at the type of abuse that an individual has actually experienced, we are able to better understand the type of rape that the person may engage in, if at all. Now, in the final section, we will look at other factors that contribute to sexual assault. To start, we will look at social-cultural factors. If we look at the dimension of individualism and collectivism, we will see that collectivism or collectivist societies are less likely to have incidences of rape, in the sense that individual needs are usually subordinated or not put forward, where the greater good of the society is instead considered. Interpersonal conflict is usually also minimal, and there is a high sense of personal shame for acting out against society's norms. However, it's also important to understand that it may be difficult to assess exactly what is rape, because rape may be defined differently in individualistic versus collectivist cultures. Also know that in cultures where there is inequality, there is a higher frequency of rape. Societies that have higher levels of social disorganization are also more likely to have higher frequency of rape. In this sense, gender inequality is defined as male socialization, where if males are socialized to believe that it is okay for them to use violence if their sexual advances are past, they are more likely to resort to rape because they don't see anything wrong with it. In terms of social disorganization, things like geographical mobility, wars, single parent families, or lack of religious affiliation is also likely to contribute to higher frequency of rape. Feminist theory puts another perspective in helping us understand this from a social perspective. For a start, almost all feminists agree that rape is a grave wrong, and one that is too often ignored, mischaracterized, or legitimized within society. They say that if you want to overcome rape or stop rape, then rape needs to be combated both legally and socially. They go about challenging the myth that rape is rare and exceptional, and instead they're trying to say that rape or sexual assault is a common experience in the lives of many girls and women. They propose that rape is associated with gender inequality, especially in terms of social status and power, and that very often the motive for rape is a desire for power or dominance over women and not sexual arousal in itself. They propose that as societies become more equal, rape is less likely to occur, which is why it's important for societies to be more equal and the gender gap to be closed. Now, in recent years, we've seen many cases of rape occurring in India, particularly violent group rapes. If you watch this video by clicking on this link here, we'll find out more about it. Social learning theory, on the other hand, proposes that rapists learn to be rapists by learning pro-rape beliefs and attitudes from their social environment, from the social group around them. They say that exposure, especially early exposure to violent porn, is also likely to increase male propensities to commit rape or behave aggressively and violently towards women in general. These findings have been supported many times in other areas as well by the social learning theories. Finally, the last social cultural factor we'll look at is evolution. And some evolutionary psychologists propose that rape is actually very instinctive in nature, and sexually aggressive men act in a way so that they have a reproductive edge over other men. Personally, this is not something I subscribe to, but that's what some researchers believe in. Other factors that may contribute to sexual assault are psychological abnormalities, where the perpetrator may have a personality disorder or suffer from a psychological disorder. One such example is we know that rape has been linked to narcissistic personality disorders, where the perpetrator is fixated on himself and his or her own gratification. As a result of this, they are unlikely to feel remorse and also have very low levels of empathy towards the victim. Taken together, this is likely to result in the perpetrator committing more of such acts. Finally, in this last slide, we look at different theoretical explanations that try and help explain pedophilic behavior. The American Psychological Association's DSM defines pedophilia as recurring sexually arousing fantasies, impulsive desires or behaviors involving sexual acts with a child that occur over a period of at least 6 months. In most cases, the pedophile is at least 16 years of age and at least 5 years older than the child in question, the child in question here being the victim. They also suggest that those who suffer from pedophilia have a compulsion to abuse young children. The 4 theoretical explanations that have been proposed to explain pedophilic behavior are emotional congruence, sexual arousal, blockage, and disinhibition. In terms of emotional congruence, it is proposed that pedophiles see themselves as children with childish emotional needs and interests. Therefore, they feel most comfortable with children and try and forge relationships with children for this reason. In terms of relationships, it often starts as a friendship for them to gain the trust of the children before they progress to a more sexually based relationship. The second explanation is based on sexual arousal, where pedophiles become unusually sexually aroused to stimuli that's not typical of other adults. In this case, they're sexually aroused to stimuli associated with children, and then they act out based on these sexual fantasies. Third explanation involves blockage, where it proposes that pedophilia is the result of unattainable sexual and emotional gratification with adults, usually because the pedophile has inadequate interpersonal and social skills to actually form lasting or meaningful relationships with adults. They find it easier to actually bond and interact socially and sexually with children, and therefore they channel these sexual or emotional needs that they cannot feel with adults to the children that they're acquainted with. And finally, pedophilia could be a result of poor self-regulation and poor self-control, where the pedophile is unable to control his or her urges and therefore attempts to have sexual interactions with children instead. Now this brings us to the end of this lecture. Please also read your textbook and let me know if you have any questions. Thank you.